I am in my hotel after spending 2.5 glorious weeks exploring Portugal. It was my first time going to Portugal, and I'm so excited because I had the great opportunity to visit multiple regions, chat with winemakers, and really get to experience Portuguese culture for the first time. And I'm ready to share it all with you over the next couple episodes. I have food content, travel content, wine content, obviously, and so much more. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure you do so now so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. In today's show, I'm going to be talking about Portugal 101. This is a high level overview talking about Portugal as a wine region specifically. So there will be lots of time for the travel and food and other content coming up, but this one is about wine specifically. So if you don't know anything about Portugal as a wine region, today's episode is going to help you get that intro, that really high level overview into what this region is all about and some of the things you can look for when you're shopping for Portuguese wine. All right, so Portugal as a country is pretty rugged. That was one of the first things that I realized in traveling here. From the terroir to the people, it's a rugged country with a really interesting past. The Portuguese were known as the conquerors and the explorers, and they discovered a lot of Africa and Asia. But over centuries, as time passed and political turmoil hit the region, there was a poverty that came over the area, and it became really difficult for a lot of Portuguese to be able to make a living and have a bit more wealth compared to other regions throughout Europe. One of the exports that has really helped keep Portugal on the map for many years is wine. And Portuguese wines have been in the hands of royalty, nobility, and the common man for a long time, especially when we're talking about port. So port is a fortified wine that is made in Portugal, and we're going to talk a little bit about it today. We're going to dive into it in depth in the coming weeks with a lot of episodes. I had wonderful interviews with multiple port houses and producers, and so I'm excited to share more with you all soon. But port is not the only wine that's made in Portugal, so we're going to talk about some of the other wines you can find throughout Portugal today. But when you're shopping for Portuguese wine, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. So first off, Portugal is really unique in that the grape varieties are plentiful. So for a country that's only about a quarter the size of California, there are over 250 indigenous grape varieties here. Now there's other regions of the world that have a lot of indigenous grape varieties too. We think about Greece, Italy, and so many more where there's hundreds and hundreds of indigenous grape varieties. But often those regions have focused on a handful of varieties, and that's really what those countries or smaller sub-appellations are known for. It's not really the case in Portugal. So again, when we think about Burgundy, you would think Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. When you think of Tuscany, you might think Sangiovese. But with Portugal, it's a little bit different. These grape varieties have been interplanted often in vineyards, and so you have winemakers that are harvesting grapes together of multiple varieties, and they're making blends. So they're making red blends because the grapes are actually being grown in the vineyard, intermingled with one another. Now, this does happen in some other regions of the world, but it's very, very common throughout Portugal. And so what that means is that instead of finding a lot of single variety wines, throughout Portugal, you're really going to find a lot of blends. There are tons of red blends, white blends, rosé blends, and port is always a blend also. This means that often when you're shopping for Portuguese wine, you're really only going to see two main things listed on the bottle. You may see vino tinto, which means red wine, or vino branco, white wine. Now, on the back of the label and sometimes on the front, you may see a couple of the grape varieties listed. Don't panic if they're not ones that you're familiar with or that you can pronounce. Often you won't find things like Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon as commonly throughout Portugal. You're going to find more of the indigenous local grape varieties, but I can assure you that these blends are absolutely delicious, and the Portuguese winemakers are used to working with a lot of these unique indigenous grapes, and so the blends are really well balanced and absolutely phenomenal. The one other term that you may often see listed on the label is going to be quinta. Now, quinta is basically like the wine farmhouse, and so it's kind of similar to the word maison when you see that in French wine labels, but it basically means this is the house or the family that produces this particular wine. Now, one thing that was really apparent as I was traveling throughout Portugal, speaking with winemakers and industry professionals, is how a lot of the younger generations are exiting winemaking, and we're seeing that some of those smaller quintas or family-owned properties are turning over their vineyards to large companies. Again, the countryside is really rugged in Portugal, and I think it's been a challenge for many years to produce wine in the region. And so what we're seeing is a lot of younger individuals wanting to move to Lisbon, Porto, and the larger cities throughout Portugal, and abandoning that countryside lifestyle where grapes are being grown and a lot of wines are being produced. So that is a big challenge that's coming to the region. And I think winemakers right now are trying to find ways to have new creative laws and things that get young winemakers excited about the industry. But it is definitely a big challenge that many of the older winemakers were referring to as I was traveling around. So something important and interesting happening in the region. Now, what you see as you're traveling through the region is that a lot of the wine regions are fairly dry. Again, Portugal is a very rugged country. And even in the Douro Valley, where you have these beautiful rolling hills, the vineyards are grown into the hillside. So it's very steep, very terraced, where the grapes are grown on these like stone terraces to prevent erosion. But what that means is that throughout a lot of Portugal, harvesting grapes, maintaining grapes, it's all very manual labor. It's hard, it's done by hand. A lot of the winemaking process is still done by hand. In fact, I learned that lagares, which are these large wine vats where grapes are crushed by foot, are very common throughout most of Portugal still. To be honest, before traveling to Portugal, I thought that lagares were used on occasion in some wineries that were trying to keep the tradition alive of grape stomping. Shout out to I Love Lucy, you've all seen that episode. But believe it or not, it's actually still very common throughout much of Portugal to stomp grapes by foot and have that be the main way of crushing grapes. So again, very manual labor type of work. And so it's unique. I think it's a great tradition, but it does tend to make it a little bit harder for the winemaking process, which means that a lot of younger individuals are not quite sure that it may be the calling for them, even though their parents and grandparents and generations prior were committed to winemaking. Now, before we dive into some of the specific regions throughout Portugal, one fun fact that I love to mention is that Portugal is also the largest cork producer in the world. So traveling through Portugal, I saw cork bags, cork coasters, kitchen utensils, you name it, and of course, wine corks. So Portugal is the leading producer of corks for wine production. And so they harvest the bark from cork trees and are producing corks. And so it's a really interesting aspect of the wine industry, and it's something that is pivotal as a huge export within Portugal today. All right, so there are technically 31 DOCs, and DOCs are regions of origin that fit a particular criteria set by the EU. And so there's 31 throughout Portugal that are known for producing wine. But in practicality, there's really only 8 that you want to be aware of, and that's because of just the history of winemaking in Portugal right now, where we're at, who's producing large amounts of wine and exporting. So these are kind of the main producing regions that you want to be aware of. And what I'll do is I'll really briefly give you a high-level overview of each of these 8 regions, and we will focus on just 1 or 2 of them in upcoming episodes, because those are the ones that I had the chance to visit over the last 2.5 weeks. So the first one is the Douro River Valley, and the Douro River Valley is a pretty big region, and it's well known because it is where port production takes place. So the Douro River actually starts in Spain, and then it flows out to the coast where the city of Oporto is. And the Douro Valley is broken into 3 main regions. You have the Baixa Corgo, the Cima Corgo, and the Douro Superior. And again, these 3 regions have different expositions. They're located in different regions throughout the Douro Valley. And so you're going to find a really unique diversification between these regions where different grapes are grown, and you have a lot of white varieties, a lot of red varieties. And again, in the more high quality vineyards, they're going to be growing these grapes specifically for port production. And traditionally, the port was actually produced in the valley, and then it was floated in these large barrels on boats down the river to Oporto, the city that was on the coast, and that's where the port would wait in port cellars, in port houses, to be purchased typically by British merchants and then sold abroad. So that was the old process, and then it actually became legal later to actually both produce and store the port in the house in the Douro Valley. So you see about 60% still in the valley today, but many is still cellared in Villanova de Gaia, which is the city that's just technically on the other side of the river from Oporto, but it's in that region right on the coast. And so we still see a lot of port that is cellared there before it leaves to go abroad. So we'll talk more about port in just a minute because it is a really important wine to know from Portugal. And we're going to do deep dives into the Douro River Valley as well as Oporto, the city, because I had a lot of time in these two regions and really beautiful, incredible wine regions, and definitely a fun one to visit. If you love sweet fortified wines, and even if you just love still wine, it was absolutely stunning. So I won't say too much yet. I have lots of exciting content coming from winemakers I spoke with and different brands that I had the chance to meet with, but definitely a really, really amazing region, and one that I cannot recommend enough. Is a fabulous place to visit. All right, so next is the Dow. This is a region that's really been developing mostly since the 1980s. There was some legislation that was making the grapes mostly sold for cooperatives in the past in this region. So since the 80s, we've started seeing a little more of a presence of independent winemakers in this region, and it's just below the Douro, and so it's known for acidic grapes. Both red and white are being produced here, and so really a growing region with a lot of great quality coming out of the Dow now. And it's definitely one where we're seeing a lot of complexity from the wines. So again, quality has been growing, complexity is growing, and so the Dow is a really good region to be aware of when you're looking at Portuguese wines. Next is the Minho or Vinho Verde, and this is a region that if you've had a white wine from Portugal in the United States, it was probably from Vinho Verde, it was probably from the Minho region. And this region is known predominantly for white, crisp, mineral forward, refreshing white wines. It can be from up to 20 white grapes, but often from here you're going to see Alvarinho or Albarino, which is what the grape is called in Spain, just on the other side of the border. And this is a really classic white wine style from Portugal. It has a lot of great food pairings, and so we see a lot of Vinho Verde making its way to the United States. Vinho Verde specifically means green wines, and it's referring to that kind of mineral forward characteristic that a lot of the wines have from this region because it's in northwest Portugal, right along the coast. So you're getting that oceanic influence, and it gives the grapes this really beautiful character. Also, because of the soil in the region, you find a lot of minerality that makes these wines really crisp and refreshing, especially on a hot summer day. All right, so next up we have Bairrada. This is in the northwest of Portugal, kind of just below the Douro and the Dow. And it is a cooler climate, a little bit rainy, and so it's actually really great for sparkling wine production. So we see about 20% of the Portuguese sparkling wines coming out of this region. It's also known for more acidic wines, so acidic red wines are coming out of the region. And up until the last few years, it was not considered the highest quality region, but we're seeing a lot of younger winemakers that are moving to this region to make sparkling wines, and then also to kind of play with the unique terroir that's here. And so I'm excited to see what comes out of Bairrada in the next couple years. Next up we have Alentejo. So this is actually in kind of the middle southeast of the country. It borders Spain, and it's also known for a really hot, dry climate. So this region is growing a lot of powerful reds, acidic red wines. It's also a growing region for agritourism. So I am sad that I missed Alentejo on this trip. I've heard it's absolutely beautiful. Also really known for cows and a lot of pork. So delicious food and delicious wines coming out of Alentejo, and a really budding tourism market. So definitely a great place to check out on my next trip to Portugal. But for now, definitely a fun place where we're seeing some really bold and powerful red wines coming out of the region. Then we have Lisboa or Setúbal. So Lisboa is kind of the larger region, and as the name suggests, it's surrounding the capital city of Lisbon. And in the south of Lisboa, you have Setúbal. So Setúbal is a small region that is specifically known for a sweet fortified wine made from Moscatel of Setúbal. But the rest of the Lisboa region is known for, I'm going to say, very like affordable, approachable wines, both white and red. Since it's on the coast, you get a little bit of that maritime influence. Overall, again, it's more affordable, approachable wines, but we're starting to see some exciting things coming from this. I tried a lot of natural wines from that area, so I think there's a growing community in Lisboa that is elevating the wines, but up to this point, it's been just really great table wine, and then the really exciting fortified sweet wines from Setúbal. Two more to go, so we have the Algarve. I loved the Algarve. As a Florida girl, the Algarve felt like home. It is sandy beaches, beautiful sunshine, surfing, and I had such a fun week there. I will admit that I didn't do a lot of wine tasting while I was in the Algarve because I was enjoying the surf and the sun and the sand. But the Algarve is known for really hot climate reds. So it's dry, and although you have the maritime influence, it's still really hot. So they're actually starting to see a lot of really bold reds blended with some international varieties like Syrah. And I got to try a couple red blends that were absolutely delicious. So I think this region is really growing because of the tourism that's coming to Algesur. And so instead of just being about sand and sun, there's definitely some wine production that's growing in the region. Also, predominantly focused on reds, not as much whites. While you'll find them there, the reds are really where the flavor profile is at. So focus on reds if you're trying something from Algesur. And then last but not least is Madeira. So Madeira is an island off the coast of Portugal known exclusively for its incredible fortified sweet wine. So really when people think Portugal, they're often thinking Port and Madeira, two sweet fortified wines that are very well known around the world. Madeira is known as one of the wines that can age for many, many centuries. I mean, it's incredible how long this wine can last. And a fun fact, it was also one of the wines that was a favorite of many of the founding fathers of the United States because it is something that, again, ages for a long time. And at the time, obviously, we were fighting with the British, so we didn't really want to promote port. So we switched over to Madeira because port was the preferred choice of the Brits. And so we decided to go for the Madeira. So, fun fact, but Madeira is an outstanding fortified wine. It's a really delicious sweet wine and a great one to check out. There are other wines that are being produced on the island of Madeira, but predominantly when you're looking at what it's known for, the island is known for the production of this fortified sweet wine. Now, I've done a lot of episodes on fortified sweet wines in the past, so you can actually check one of those out and learn a little bit more about Madeira. Sadly, I didn't make it to Madeira this trip. I hope to do it in the future, so I'm going to focus a lot in the coming weeks on port because those are the wines that I really spent my time visiting and getting to taste and meet with winemakers about on this trip, but hopefully in the future I can visit Madeira and then I'll have more content on that. But in the meantime, you can check out that episode that kind of is a brief overview on fortified wines. I'll have it linked here below so that you can check it out. All right, so let's talk about port for a second because as I mentioned a moment ago, port is one of the most important wines coming out of Portugal, if not the most important. So it's good to have a high level understanding of what this wine is all about. Similar to champagne, port has to be made in the Douro Valley or else it cannot be called port. And there are a lot of restrictions and legislations that govern how port production is made, how port is distributed. And this is all done by Wines of Portugal, which is a governing body that determines wines throughout Portugal, how they can be grown, made, distributed. But in port specifically, there's this governing body over port that also determines all of the unique factors of how port can be made and sold. So port is a fortified wine. And let's talk about what that means. So basically, with port production, remember a little bit earlier in the episode, I talked about the vineyards and how often the grapes are interplanted, the grape varieties are interplanted within one vineyard because historically, that's how grapes were planted throughout Portugal because port was a blend of red grapes. And so you would harvest these grapes from the vineyard, you would crush the grapes, and then you would add a clear grape spirit or brandy. In Portuguese, they call it aguardente. So you add this aguardente to the crushed grape juice, and that would stop the fermentation process. And so the winemaker would decide when they want to stop the fermentation process, depending on how sweet they want the wine to be, what they want the overall flavor profile to be. I'm simplifying things significantly here, but this is just a start, a high-level overview. But they add the aguardente, and so that is going to fortify the wine. And basically it means it's a higher alcohol content. It's going to preserve the wine a little bit longer, help it to age a little bit easier, and it's going to change the overall uniqueness of the flavor profile as well of the wine. And so you can have red port, white port, rosé port was actually added a few years ago. So that is now also an allowable type of port. But within that, you also have a lot of different styles. And so I'm really simplifying things here by sharing that the process is basically adding brandy to fermented grape juice and then you age it because there's a lot of different styles. There's tawny, there's ruby, there's late bottle vintage, colheita, single quinta. There's a lot of different styles of port. And so I'm gonna do a deep dive full episode on port coming up in the next few weeks here with a lot of the information that I got from the winemakers and brands that I spoke with. I got a lot of tastings, and so we'll talk about tastings and you'll be be able to walk through some of those with me as if you were here in the Douro getting to experience it together. But for now, hopefully that's a really good high-level overview of basically what is a fortified wine? How is it different from a standard table wine? Standard table wines are going to have typically anywhere from like 11 to 14 or 15% alcohol by volume. But because in port you've added this aguardiente, this grape brandy, this spirit that has about 70 to 75% alcohol by volume, the wine, when you are enjoying it, this fortified wine is going to have anywhere from like 20 to 25% alcohol by volume. So we're talking typically double what would be in a standard table wine. So it's a little bit sweeter, it's a much higher alcohol content. So often port is going to be served in a much smaller glass. This is a table wine, this is a red wine, but typically you would have a smaller glass for a port with just a little tasting in it. Typically 1 to 2 ounces is a standard serving because it is a much higher alcohol content. So you don't need a full glass like this because you would be feeling it very, very soon. All right, so again, more to come on port in the coming weeks, but hopefully this was a really good start for a high-level overview into Portuguese wines for you. I think the biggest thing to remember right now is that while Port and Madeira are the most well-known wines coming out of Portugal, these are fortified sweet wines, there are a lot of amazing table wines that are being made here. I would say right now they're very affordable and approachable. That's kind of predominantly what you're going to find, but there are also some great quality ones that are coming out of Portugal, and I think that's growing because we're seeing consumers in general move away from sweeter wines. For the most part, a lot of consumers over the last few decades have been looking for a drier style, and so we have seen the production of Port and Madeira decreasing, and more winemakers are moving toward table wines and moving away from that sweet fortified style or lessening their production of that style. The other thing to remember is don't panic if when you're shopping for Portuguese wines you're not familiar with the grape varieties or you don't even see grape varieties on the bottle. Remember that Portugal is a little different than a lot of other wine regions in that they are used to growing and using all 250 grape varieties that are indigenous to the region, including some international varieties also. So you may see some labels that just say red wine or white wine. You may see some labels that include a couple of varieties, but you may not be familiar with all of them. Maybe you see Alvarinho, Tinto Cao, Touriga Franca, Touriga Nacional, some of these major grape varieties that are pretty common across Portugal, but you may also see blended in there some grape varieties that you've never heard of. That's okay. That's very normal in Portugal, and the Portuguese winemakers are used to working with a lot of these unique indigenous varieties to find great balance and flavor profiles. So it's definitely a unique region where you kind of have to just trust and explore a bit because it's a little bit harder to get a grasp on specific varieties for each region within the country, so each like sub-appellation. It's going to be a little bit harder to call out some specific varieties because the region is just littered with tons of indigenous varieties that are being grown and used. And again, you see some of those common varieties. You see Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, Tinto Cao. So you see some of those that are going to be kind of common pillars throughout many sub-appellations, but you'll find a lot of other varieties that are blended within that. And that's very normal, very common throughout Portugal, and also really delicious. Now, while I was in the Douro, I had a chance to sit down with Luis Chabra, and he is a winemaker in the Douro that is really known for studying soil types. And he's actually been like at the cutting edge of studying soil types and terroir throughout Portugal over the last few years. And he's bringing a lot of awareness to how unique varieties grow really well in certain climates and certain terroirs. So I'm excited at how he's influencing the region because I think a lot of winemakers are looking to him and looking at how can we start to carve out some unique varieties that we know grow specific to certain terroir within Portugal. And so he gave me a fabulous overview, and it was a little focused on the Douro, but we spoke briefly about all of Portugal, and he talked about soil types. So let me go ahead and include that here now. Let's take a look at it together, and this will give you another really great overview into some of the things that you can expect from Portugal and also from the upcoming episodes that I have planned.
This is Portugal. Welcome to Portugal. To explain you a little bit what it is, south part, you can see that the mountains are more on the northern part of Portugal. The big majority of this area, it's granite. We have small amount of slate here in Lima and spread here in Trás-os-Montes just a little bit. We have a tiny bit here in the down region, and we have chalky soil on Bairrada region. It's the only area that is 100% chalk soil. And here, it's the Douro Valley, it's 100% slate or schist. So what's what's happening is if you see all the valleys of the river, this is the deepest valley. Probably the slate is a softer stone, so the water, after millions of years, did make a more deeper valley, and that's what makes this so special for the port wines. And another fact is having this a chain of three mountains that protects Douro from the Atlantic influence. So normally the clouds come from the sea, they raise up to the mountain, it rains here, and then the more you go inland, the less it rains. The Douro is slate, but all the outskirts of the Douro, it's granite. So what is very interesting. So Douro is roughly divided in between three main regions: Baixo Corgo, Cima Corgo, Douro Superior. Doesn't tell much about all the difference, but it is a start. And we have around 44,000 hectares of vineyards, what is a lot in terms of area. What happens if you go inland? The more you go inland, the less it rains. And the more you go inland, the warmer it gets if you are by the river. But the truth is, for me, and I think for the majority of the people in the Douro, the best white wine areas are in Douro Superior. So our white wines come from here, Meda, and another good white wine area is this one. So they are upper Douro, but they are much higher in altitude, so they are no outskirts of the Douro. The organization of the Douro was done by the British business, more or less, so port industry. Until 1986 was forbidden to sell port wines directly from here. They all had to be sold from Porto. It was a way for them to control the business. All the port houses that now they have vineyards in the Douro Valley, they started only here, traveling after harvest up the Douro, buying the wines already made, and bring the wines down by the river on the springtime and age them here. So people that are working here with wines, aging the wines, they never saw the vineyards and never done a harvest. People here were very poor, so they would done their still wines after the port wines with the same hygiene. So normally by the month of Feb, March, there will be already vinegar that they will keep on drinking because they didn't have any other means. So always been a very big, and another interesting thing, there were the big properties that the owners were living in Porto that vinified for the big houses. So those big properties would buy grapes on the surroundings to other small growers. So the result from here to the final wine was a big gap. So and the tradition in Portugal was always blending varieties, blending different wines. So no one knew exactly what was exactly the terroir of the different wines. And this is what we're trying to do here. Douro started making, we have the most famous still wine in Portugal, it's Barca Velha, that was done in the Douro Valley, probably blend with different regions down and others. That would be the tradition then. And for a long period, we didn't have any interesting wines. Then in the 80s, we had 2-3 brands. Pacheco was one of them. Then when they started, it already had a lot of changes. But in the 80s, they had interesting wines. Then that disappeared. And then the big boom of dry wines were late 90s, early 2000s. So it's very recent. So that's everything is to be known. And that's the reason why I have the soils we work with, because if you ask here the majority of the growers, what's the soil, they will tell you slate, but you have different kind of slates.
Okay.
This is the blue slate, a hard stone, have a metallic sound, so even if you walk on the stones with your eyes closed, you know you're walking on the blue slate. Very difficult to break. That normally gives wines that are a little bit more grumpy, I would say, tight. They are not very exuberant, they take time to open up. The tannin is always a bit more edgy because you don't have much clay, so the roots, the vineyards suffer to survive here, the roots have to go very deep, so their wines are a bit more shut down. Then you have the yellow slate. As you can see, the sound is completely different. So the yellow slate is a stone that is softer and you can break it easier. So that's what happened here. We done these 2 boxes in 2013, only with stones. So this is what happened in the soil. I tell everyone that you can come here and break one stone with a small stone with your own fingers, and that's what people do. And then, you see, And then what they done, they create soil. So this is a soil with more clay. And soils with more clay tend to give wines a bit rounder, more fruity, more approachable. And that is the two main soils we work for the red wines. There are others, some of them with more iron, but this is the two ones that we mainly work. And then for the white wines, my favorite, and that's why the outskirts here are, for me, very good areas for whites. This is also a slate, but is mica schist. So this is a slate that was formed near the granite, so have the minerals of the granite. It's also easy to break. You can see that it's very sandy, but this stone is even, you see these brilliant dots are mica, and the black dots are feldspar, and this is the same thing you find in the granite stone. So this gives, for me, gives wines that have the combination of the two. Of course, I cannot prove that, so it's because minerality is a big discussion, but for me gives the combination of vertical metallic acidity of the granite plus the volume of the schist. So that's what we have. So, and this is more or less what we do.
Amazing. All right, I hope you enjoyed that quick overview from Luis. I had a fabulous time visiting him at his winery, and you're gonna see that content coming up in the next couple weeks because he gave a beautiful overview of some amazing wines that they're making, and I got to walk through the cellar, taste wines out of the barrel, and I'm bringing you all along with me. It was a really fun time, and he was a fabulous host. So hopefully that was a really great intro into some of the soil types and terroir and things that you are going to learn a little bit more about as we talk about Portugal in the coming weeks. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned something new. If you did, please drop a comment below or share this episode with a friend. That helps more people learn about the Wine CEO and gives me more opportunities to meet with winemakers and share the content with you. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure you do so now. As I mentioned, I have a lot of Portuguese content coming over the next couple weeks, including some really exciting travel content. I got to stay in some beautiful hotels, including sleeping in a wine barrel. It was unreal, absolutely beautiful and amazing. Had the best time, and I can't wait to share it all with you in the next couple weeks. So until next week, friends, I hope you drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all in the next episode of the Wine CEO podcast.